Every day, you and I get bombarded with negative news. And just like our bodies becomes what we eat, our minds become the information that we consume. If you want to stay positive, it's so important that you also listen to stories that inspires you and uplifts you. In this podcast, we interview world-leading experts dedicated to solving the world's most pressing problems. And if you stick around, I promise you will not only be as informed as if you watch the news, you will feel uplifted, inspired, and have more positive energy in your life. Welcome to Great.com Talks with. Hi and welcome. Today Great.com talks with Rachel Strower, who is the acting president of landinstitute.org. And if you haven't heard of them before, they are a global movement for perennial agriculture. And you're going to learn everything about what that means in a minute. But if you're new here into this podcast, you definitely want to press subscribe, either on YouTube or in your podcast app, because today we're going to look at how we can grow food that is built on self-sustaining ecosystems. Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy you're here. So may I ask to begin with, what does perennial agriculture mean for someone that is not a native speaker, English speaker?
Yes. So it's important first to talk about what the agriculture that we have, which is primarily based on annual grains grown in monocultures or one crop on vast expanses of fields. And that's on primarily the majority of our agriculture system is based on an annual technology grown in monocultures. There are areas where that's not the case, but we're focused on that sort of majority of land. And that land is tilled up or killed off every year on an annualized basis, which is why it's annual. It is, and then what we have to do is we have to, because we've killed it off, we have to start using chemical inputs to sort of try to mimic what would happen in a natural system. We put fertilizer on it, we put pesticide on it, and we use these chemical inputs rather than an ecological system, which uses the natural inputs and systems. So that's our current agricultural system. And a perennial system is based on perennial plants. So the actual plants, instead of either dying or being killed on an annual basis, they live in the ground year after year after year and produce food for humans year after year after year without needing to be tilled or killed off. And the idea here is that if we can get perennial grains produced in diverse systems, then we can create an agriculture that acts naturally more like the natural ecosystem that built the world's agricultural soils rather than the current agricultural system does. So perennial plants growing in diverse mixtures are featured in nearly every natural ecosystem in the world. And what we're trying to do at the Land Institute is bring perenniality and diversity back to agriculture on a broad scale so that it can function more like a natural ecosystem and not need the chemical inputs of nitrogen-based fertilizer or pesticide, herbicide treatments.
That was a clear explanation. Thank you so much. I very much enjoyed it. So I have more questions about the organization and we will get to that. But I'm so curious. I have many questions on what you just said. So the perennial agriculture, then the same grain is in the ground, it doesn't die. Does it mean that it's coming up like every other year, and every other year there's another grain coming up, but it's still alive in the soil? Just help me understand how it's working.
Yes. So with an annual plant, the soil is left bare for many months of the year. With a perennial, it does stay in the ground. So roots the very deep perennial roots are in the ground year over year over year on a continuous basis. It's building soil organic matter, sequestering soil carbon, stewarding nutrients and water resources effectively. And the plant would get cut off at harvest time, the seeds harvested. And so you see some plant matter above the ground after that happens. And then over the subsequent months, it grows back and flowers again and produces more seed. So right now, the grains that we're working on produce a crop at least once a year, sometimes twice a year.
So help me understand then what would be the advantages of this kind of system? Because I mean, the system we have, yes, we use pesticides, and I understand that those have negative health consequences. But at the same time, we have, managed to expand our population vastly. We have become, our life expectancy has risen a lot. We have become better at dealing with diseases. So what is the problem with the system we're having now?
So I think we can agree, and it's pretty broadly agreed upon, that the way that we grow the majority of our food now will not sustain the soil resource upon which it depends for thousands of more years. We might have in some areas, the lowest number I've heard is 60 years. So some areas only have about 60 years of soil resource to produce food on. And other areas might have thousands of years under current practices to produce food on. But we're not going to live forever on our current practices. And so there's sort of an imperative that we come up with a system that can sustain and regenerate soil resource and all of the resources upon which our food production depends over millennium.
Got it. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, that these monotonous practices are sucking up the nutrients from the soil and making it weaker. So what is the bottleneck for you then? Why aren't we deploying these new kind of perennial ecosystems on a large scale?
Well, I think the bottleneck to date has been there wasn't proof that it was possible, that you could have a high yielding perennial crop that simultaneously grows large, juicy fruit, seeds for human consumption, and also maintains its deeply rooted perenniality. And at the Land Institute, over the last about 20 years of intensive plant breeding, along with partners at other institutions, we've really come to a point where we can see that it will be possible, it is possible to create high yielding perennial grain crops for the grain producing regions of the world. And so that was the bottleneck, and now that bottleneck is sort of opened, and it's more about getting this work happening and in all of the grain producing regions of the world, and getting more researchers doing more breeding and crop development and agronomic work to really make these systems viable for the farmers and ultimately the consumers who will be nourished by them.
I'm real curious to hear how the Land Institute then will be a part of scaling up this system. I know that you recently received a international prize, and that is a way for you to start scaling up this kind of work. So how do you plan to do that? Like, because I mean, where do you begin with when it's such a large scales?
Sure. Well, the good thing is that we at the Land Institute already have collaborators on 6 continents. So we already have research friends working on this work at a smaller scale than we would like to see ultimately. So we have some relationships built in places like Sweden, France, Uganda, China, Argentina, I'm missing a bunch, but those are some examples. Australia. And what we want to do over the next 10 years is really develop an initiative that we're calling New Roots International, which is a scale up of our international collaborations and really focused on a strategy where we have hubs of activity happening in some key areas, growing those hubs over time, and producing a network, a collaborative network for those researchers to share data and germplasm or plant material and really help elevate the work on a global scale. We say we're trying to ignite the movement and co-lead that movement with our collaborators all over the globe.
Mm. So if you manage to change the system, what would be the main benefits for, I guess, the industry in itself, but in the end for the end consumers? Would it be mainly less pesticides? Would it be higher nutritional values? Would it be lower prices? What do you see could change with this new kind of system?
We really think about the change as the impact of this work, especially if we're able to, I should point out that we are focused on grain crops, and there are other perennial crops in development or that we already eat. A lot of nuts are tree crops that are perennial. And we're focused on grains because grains cover over 70% of our agricultural lands and accommodate about over 70% of our global caloric intake. So we eat a lot of grains and they cover a lot of soil. And so we're really trying to have an impact at that large scale. And if we can get there, I think the impact really starts in the soil. We start to have healthy soil that can rebuild itself over time and sustain production for longer periods of time. A lot of times we say we want to create an agriculture that can sustain the most number of humans for the longest period of time possible. So to me, the impact starts in the soil, and then next in the sort of supply chain is the farmer. The farmer is using far less chemical inputs, which is an expense for them. They are reducing their carbon emissions from their machinery, passes through the field, and other inputs in terms of having needing to till and make multiple runs through the field during the course of the year. That's minimized by the perennial. And then you move up the supply chain to the consumer. And I think for the consumer, it is like sort of, which I think of as humanity, right? Is that we get to eat for a long time into the future. We have more assurance that our children and grandchildren will have sustenance and have it within the ecological limits of the resources upon which we depend. So there are a lot of studies out there about the relationship between soil health and human health in terms of the food that we eat off of the soil. And so there are probably some human health benefits down the road, but we really think of it more as a sort of soil, farm, and ecosystem health, the ecosystem of which we humans are a part.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, it's easy to see how it could be helpful for climate change and yeah, many other areas as well. So when a new seed, like how does it work? Let's say a new seed is invented. Is that similar to, if Tesla upgrades their car, all Teslas are getting better at once? Is it kind of similar with a seed that if someone discovers a better seed that, okay, everybody's just starting to use this? Or is it a long process that is happening over, tens of years?
It's probably more likely the longer process. Mm-hmm. I think of it more in terms of technology like Tesla or the iPod or something that sort of revolutionized the way we do some activity. It's more in the R&D phase, sort of the beta phase right now and early on. So these crops will begin to come out, but then you have to go through the process of sort of focus groups and how do the farmers use them? how do farmers optimize their use with the equipment that they have available, and how does the supply chain, the entire supply chain has to sort of evolve as these new crops come online. So we think probably about a decade for that to happen. But I think once we're in that rhythm, they can come online more quickly. Just like today, we have a new variety of corn every year, and that easily goes into the supply chain because it's not that different from the corn that the grower produced last year.
Got it. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. So you obviously work with, how to say, is it culturing or growing? You're creating new seeds, right?
Yes.
By human selection. So we're coming towards the end of this interview. Imagine now that someone is listening to this and they want to take some kind of positive action towards a more sustainable agriculture. What can they do as individuals?
Ooh, that's a great question, and hard for us because we're sort of an R&D group. So the thing that people can do is simply learn more about this work, and they can go to our website, see what we're up to. We have a lot happening at the Land Institute and our partner organizations. Get educated about the food system and the importance of soil to it. I think a lot of us, with over 50% of the population living in urban areas, a lot of times don't get close with where our food comes from and the importance of the large swaths of land that are producing it and the soil that it depends on. So yeah, I'd say get educated and get involved. We have a really great civic science program at the Land Institute where folks volunteer from all over, mostly in the US to date, but I imagine this spreading to other international areas as well, can engage. You get a packet of seeds, you plant them, and then you provide data back to the scientists about how well it grew in your area, what it looked like, if there's any pests or pathogens that have compromised it, and so on and so forth. So citizens can sort of become part of the science in those programs.
That sounds
More
exciting.
Information on that. Yes, and there's information on that on our website.
landinstitute.org. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with Great.com today. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And for you listening, if you enjoyed this conversation and if you would like to see more sustainable agriculture, press subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app, because that is showing the algorithms that this conversation is important so that we can together ignite a global movement for perennial agriculture. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode. What is Great.com? That is the most common question that we get. And the shortest answer I can give you is that we are a company that is moving money from the online casino industry and donates it to charities that is helping the environment. The long answer, unfortunately, I don't have time to tell you today. But if you're curious, definitely Google what is Great.com to learn more.